I've always known I was the mistake. Dad made sure of that from the moment I could understand words. "You were never wanted," he'd say during his worst moments, usually after a few too many beers. "We only planned your brother." Those words became the soundtrack of my childhood, playing on repeat every time I disappointed him, which seemed to be constantly. Gregory was 2 years older, the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was just the accident that happened afterward. Growing up in Jefferson City, our house felt like a museum dedicated to Gregory's achievements. His baseball trophies lined the mantelpiece, his honor roll certificates covered the refrigerator, and his school photos took up prime real estate on Dad's desk at work. Meanwhile, my accomplishments were met with lukewarm acknowledgement at best. When I made the debate team, Dad just grunted and asked if Gregory had ever done debate. When I got accepted to the National Honor Society, he wondered aloud why I couldn't be more like my brother who had been president of his class. The favoritism wasn't subtle. Gregory got the bigger bedroom, the newer clothes, and Dad's undivided attention during every conversation. When we'd go out for ice cream, Dad would ask Gregory what flavor he wanted first, then order for me without asking. "She'll have vanilla," he'd say, as if my preferences didn't matter enough to warrant a question. I learned early that my voice was secondary, my needs an afterthought, my very existence something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Mom tried to balance things out, but she was caught between keeping peace with Dad and protecting my feelings. I'd catch her giving me extra hugs when Dad wasn't looking, or slipping me an extra cookie when he was in the garage. She'd whisper that she loved me just as much, but her words felt hollow against the weight of Dad's constant rejection. Sometimes I wondered if she really meant it, or if she was just trying to ease her own guilt about not standing up to him more. School became my refuge, the one place where I could prove my worth without Dad's shadow looming over me. I threw myself into academics with a desperation that my teachers probably mistook for natural ambition. Every A+ was a small victory against the voice in my head that echoed Dad's words. I joined every club, volunteered for every project, and pushed myself harder than any teenager should have to. If I couldn't be wanted at home, maybe I could earn my place somewhere else. The worst part wasn't even the obvious favoritism. It was the way Dad looked at me sometimes, like he was calculating the cost of my existence. When Gregory needed new cleats for baseball, Dad would drive to 3 different stores to find the perfect pair. When I needed school supplies, he'd hand me $20 and tell me to figure it out myself. The message was clear. Gregory was an investment worth making, while I was just an expense to be minimized. By the time I turned 16, I'd built walls around my heart so high that even I couldn't see over them sometimes. I stopped expecting birthday parties that matched Gregory's elaborate celebrations. I stopped hoping Dad would come to my school events. I stopped believing that someday he might look at me with the same pride he reserved for his real child. The pain had calcified into something harder, a determination to prove that his rejection said more about him than it did about me. But deep down, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still wondered what I had done wrong. What cosmic mistake had I made by simply existing? Why wasn't I enough? These questions would follow me into my dreams, where sometimes Dad would smile at me the way he smiled at Gregory, and I'd wake up feeling more broken than before. I was 17 years old, and I'd already spent a lifetime trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Senior year brought new pressures, and the constant buzz about college applications. While Gregory had sailed through his applications 2 years earlier with Dad's enthusiastic help, I was navigating the process mostly alone. Dad would grunt non-committally when I mentioned deadlines or asked for help with essays, but his attention was focused on Gregory's latest achievements at State University. My brother was majoring in business, following in Dad's footsteps, and every phone call home was a celebration of his success. I'd chosen to apply for pre-med programs, partly because I genuinely loved science, but mostly because it was something Gregory had never done. For once, I wanted to carve out a space that was entirely mine, where comparisons would be impossible. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was choosing a career dedicated to healing people when I couldn't even heal the wounds in my own family. But maybe that's exactly why it called to me. I understood what it felt like to hurt. The college application process required more documentation than I'd expected. Birth certificates, social security cards, immunization records, a paper trail of my existence that I'd never really thought about before. Mom helped me gather most of the documents, but when it came to my birth certificate, she seemed oddly hesitant. "I'll have to dig through the filing cabinet," she said, avoiding my eyes. "It might take a few days." Something in her tone made me uneasy, but I was too focused on deadlines to press the issue. When she finally handed me the birth certificate a week later, her hands were shaking slightly. I barely glanced at it before stuffing it into my application envelope. Just another piece of bureaucratic paperwork standing between me and my future. The document felt heavier than it should have, but I attributed that to the weight of everything it represented. This piece of paper was my ticket out of Jefferson City, away from Dad's constant reminders that I was unwanted. The waiting period after submitting applications was torture. Every day brought new anxiety about whether I'd get accepted anywhere, whether I'd be able to afford tuition, whether I was smart enough to succeed. Dad's lack of interest in my college prospects only amplified my fears. When Gregory's acceptance letters had arrived, Dad had called everyone he knew to brag. When mine started coming, he barely looked up from his newspaper to acknowledge them. My first acceptance letter came from the University of Missouri, and I was so excited I could barely contain myself. I burst into the kitchen where Mom was making dinner, waving the letter like a victory flag. "I got in!" I shouted, expecting at least a smile, maybe even a hug. Mom's face lit up with genuine pride, but Dad just glanced over and said, "Good. At least one of my kids won't be a complete disappointment." The words hit like a physical blow, deflating my joy in an instant. That night, I lay in bed staring at the acceptance letter, trying to recapture the excitement I'd felt earlier. But Dad's words had poisoned the moment, turning what should have been a celebration into another reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I wondered if he'd ever be proud of me, if anything I accomplished would ever be enough to earn his approval. The rational part of my brain knew I should stop caring, but the little girl inside me still desperately wanted her father's love. As more acceptance letters arrived, including one from my dream school with a partial scholarship, I started to believe that maybe I could build a life where my worth wasn't determined by someone else's opinion. College would be my fresh start, a place where nobody knew I was the unwanted daughter. I could reinvent myself, become someone confident and valued. But first, I had to survive the rest of senior year in a house where my very presence felt like an imposition. Spring semester brought an unexpected complication when my top-choice university requested additional documentation for my scholarship application. They needed a certified copy of my birth certificate, not just the photocopy I'd submitted earlier. The financial aid office explained that the scholarship required verification of in-state residency going back to birth, and they needed the official seal and signatures to process my application. Without it, I'd lose the scholarship that made my dream school affordable. I asked Mom for help getting the certified copy, but she seemed even more nervous than before. "Maybe we should just go with one of your other options," she suggested, wringing her hands. "The state university is perfectly good, and it's closer to home." Her reluctance puzzled me. It was just paperwork after all. But when I pressed her about it, she got that look she always wore when Dad was about to lose his temper, like she was bracing for impact. Frustrated by the delay and worried about missing the deadline, I decided to handle it myself. The county clerk's office was downtown, just a short bus ride from school. I figured I could get the certified copy during my lunch break and have everything sorted out by the end of the week. It seemed like such a simple task. Walk in, request the document, pay the fee, and walk out. I had no idea I was about to uncover a secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The clerk was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested in helping. When I explained what I needed, she pulled up the records on her computer and frowned slightly. That's interesting," she murmured, typing something else. "Let me double-check this." She disappeared into a back room for what felt like forever, leaving me standing at the counter with a growing sense of unease. When she returned, she was carrying a file folder and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "Honey," she said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, it's okay. Are you adopted?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Adopted? The words seemed to echo in the small office space. "No," I said quickly. "I'm not adopted. Why would you ask that?" But even as I said it, pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed started shifting in my mind. Mom's nervousness, Dad's treatment of me, the way I'd always felt like an outsider in my own family. The clerk's expression grew more concerned. "According to our records, there are some irregularities with your birth certificate. The father listed doesn't match the information we have on file for your brother's birth certificate. Same mother, different fathers. She slid a piece of paper across the counter, and I stared at it in disbelief. There, in black and white, was a name I'd never heard before listed as my biological father. Not the man who'd raised me, not the man who'd spent 17 years telling me I was unwanted. My hands started shaking as the implications sank in. If this was true, then everything I'd believed about my family was a lie. Dad wasn't my biological father, which meant Gregory wasn't my full brother. The golden child I'd spent my life competing with wasn't even related to me by blood. And the man who'd made me feel unwanted my entire life had been living with the knowledge that I wasn't his biological daughter. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I stumbled out of the clerk's office in a daze, the certified birth certificate clutched in my trembling hands. The world looked different somehow, like I was seeing everything through new eyes. The bus ride home passed in a blur of questions and revelations. How long had they known? Did Gregory know? Was this why Dad had always treated me differently? And most importantly, who was my real father? And why had this been kept secret for so long? By the time I reached my front door, I was no longer the same person who'd left for school that morning. I sat in my car outside our house for nearly an hour, staring at the birth certificate and trying to process what I'd learned. The name listed as my father, Robert Chen, meant nothing to me. I'd never heard Mom or Dad mention anyone by that name, never seen it written anywhere in our house. It was like discovering I had an entire other identity that had been hidden from me my whole life. The weight of 17 years of lies pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every memory I had of feeling different, of feeling unwanted, suddenly took on a new and terrible meaning. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. She looked so normal, so innocent, that for a moment I wondered if the clerk had made a mistake. But the official seal on the document was real. The signatures were authentic, and the truth was staring me in the face. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." The humming stopped abruptly, and she turned around with that familiar look of dread. Her face immediately told me she knew exactly what this was about. I placed the birth certificate on the kitchen counter between us, like evidence in a trial. Mom's face went completely white, and she gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles turned pale. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, but we both knew the answer. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of deception and carefully guarded secrets. Finally, she sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she said, her voice muffled by tears that had been waiting 17 years to fall. The story came out in broken pieces, interrupted by sobs and long pauses where Mom seemed to be deciding how much truth she could bear to tell. She had been married to Robert Chen when she was young, barely out of high school and full of dreams about the future. They'd been happy for a while, living in a tiny apartment and planning their life together. But Robert had dreams of traveling the world, of adventures that didn't include settling down with a wife and baby. When Mom got pregnant with me, he panicked like a trapped animal. The responsibility terrified him more than anything he'd ever faced. One day she came home from her part-time job at the diner to find a note on the kitchen table and all of Robert's belongings gone. The note was brief and devastating. He couldn't handle being a father, couldn't give up his dreams of seeing the world. He was leaving for California that very day, and he asked her not to try to find him. Mom was 5 months pregnant, alone, and heartbroken in a way that she said nearly destroyed her. She never heard from him again, not even when I was born, not even when she sent pictures to his last known address. Dad, the man I'd called Dad my whole life, had been Mom's co-worker at the insurance office where she'd gotten a job after Robert left. He'd helped her through the difficult pregnancy, driving her to doctor's appointments when she was too sick to drive herself. He'd been there for the birth, pacing the hospital waiting room like an expectant father. When I was 6 months old and Mom was struggling to make ends meet, he'd asked her to marry him. "He wanted to be your father," Mom insisted through her tears, reaching across the table to touch my hand. The legal adoption had happened when I was barely a year old, so young that I had no memory of ever being anyone other than his daughter. We'd all taken his last name, and he'd insisted on being listed as my father on every school form, every medical record. "He chose you, Doris," Mom said, her voice breaking with the weight of old pain and current guilt. That has to count for something, doesn't it? But her words felt hollow against the backdrop of 17 years of emotional abuse and constant reminders that I was unwanted. How could someone who chose me make me feel so utterly rejected? The cruelest irony was becoming clear as the pieces fell into place. I was the only child Dad had ever truly chosen to raise. Gregory had been the biological accident that came later when Mom and Dad had been married for 3 years and thought they were done having children. Dad had made a conscious decision to be my father, to give me his name, to raise me as his own flesh and blood. And yet, he'd spent my entire life making me feel unwanted and unloved while treating his biological son like a precious gift. The unfairness of it was so staggering that I felt physically sick. When Dad came home that evening, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mom had called him at work to explain what had happened, so he walked through the door already knowing that our family's biggest secret was finally out in the open. The 3 of us sat around the kitchen table in the most uncomfortable silence of my life, each of us afraid to be the first to speak. Dad's face was a mask of barely controlled anger, but not at me, surprisingly, at the situation itself, at the past catching up with us. His hands were clenched into fists on the table, and I could see the internal war playing out behind his eyes. "I never wanted you to know," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion and years of buried guilt. "I thought it would be easier if you just believed you were mine from the beginning." The admission hung in the air like a confession of guilt, and I realized that he'd been carrying this secret as heavily as Mom had. But knowing the truth only made his treatment of me more confusing and painful. If he'd chosen to be my father, if he'd legally adopted me and given me his name, why had he spent 17 years making me feel like a burden? The contradiction was tearing me apart. But I needed answers to questions that had haunted me my entire life, questions that now had a context I'd never imagined. "Why did you treat me so badly if you chose to be my father?" I asked, my voice stronger than I felt, but still trembling with years of suppressed hurt. "Why did you make me feel unwanted when you literally wanted me enough to adopt me?" The words came out in a rush, 17 years of confusion and pain finally finding their voice. Dad's composure cracked like a dam breaking, and for the first time in my life, I saw him cry. Real tears, not just the watery eyes he got when he was angry. "Because every time I looked at you," he whispered, his voice breaking on each word, "I saw him. I saw the man who abandoned you and your mother when you needed him most." His shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, a place where he'd been storing this pain for nearly 18 years. And I was so angry at him, so furious that he could just walk away from something so precious that I took it out on you instead. The truth was more devastating than any lie could have been, more cruel than I could have imagined. He'd punished me for someone else's sins, made me pay for my biological father's abandonment every single day of my life. The weeks that followed that devastating kitchen table conversation were the strangest of my life. Dad seemed like a completely different person, as if confessing his secret had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for 17 years. He started asking about my college plans, actually listening when I talked about my dreams of becoming a doctor. For the first time in my memory, he looked at me without that shadow of resentment in his eyes. But the damage of 17 years couldn't be undone overnight, and I found myself suspicious of his sudden kindness. Part of me wondered if this was just guilt talking, if he'd go back to his old ways once the shock wore off. Mom threw herself into helping me prepare for college with an intensity that bordered on manic. She researched dorm room essentials, helped me apply for additional scholarships, and even started talking about visiting me on campus. It was as if she was trying to make up for 17 years of walking on eggshells around Dad's treatment of me. But late at night, I could hear her crying in her bedroom, and I knew she was grieving for all the years we'd lost to this terrible secret. The guilt was eating her alive, and no amount of college preparation could fix that. Gregory came home from State University for spring break, right in the middle of our family's emotional upheaval. When Mom and Dad sat him down to explain the truth about my parentage, his reaction surprised everyone. "I always knew something was different," he said quietly, looking at me with new understanding in his eyes. "You never looked like Dad, and you were always so much smarter than the rest of us." For the first time in our lives, my brother seemed to see me as a person rather than competition. The revelation had shifted something fundamental in our family dynamic, and Gregory was struggling to process his own guilt about the preferential treatment he'd received. The hardest part was reconciling the man who had chosen to adopt me with the man who had made my childhood miserable. Dad started sharing stories I'd never heard before, about how excited he'd been when the adoption was finalized, how proud he'd felt walking me to my first day of kindergarten as my legal father. "I used to brag about you at work," he admitted one evening, his voice thick with regret. "I'd tell everyone about my brilliant daughter who could read before she was 4. These glimpses of a father I'd never known existed made the years of rejection even more painful. He'd loved me once, before the resentment poisoned everything. As graduation approached, I found myself caught between anger and forgiveness, between the urge to run away to college and never look back, and a strange new hope that maybe our family could heal. Dad had started coming to my school events, sitting in the front row at my debate tournaments and cheering louder than any other parent. When I won the state science fair, he cried with pride and called everyone he knew to brag about my achievement. It was everything I'd dreamed of as a little girl, but it felt 17 years too late. The little girl inside me was healing, but the young woman I'd become wasn't sure she could trust this new version of her father. The night before graduation, Dad knocked on my bedroom door with a small wrapped box in his hands. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a pendant that read, "Chosen Daughter," in elegant script. "I should have given this to you years ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have reminded you every day that you weren't an accident or a mistake. You were chosen, Doris. You were wanted." As he fastened the necklace around my neck, I felt something shift inside me. Not complete forgiveness, but the beginning of understanding. We both had scars that would take time to heal, but for the first time in my life, I believed that healing was possible. College acceptance letters had been arriving steadily, and I'd been accepted to every school I'd applied to, including my dream university with a full scholarship. The irony wasn't lost on me, that discovering the truth about my parentage had led to the very documentation I needed for financial aid. As I prepared to leave Jefferson City behind, I realized that I was no longer running away from my family. I was running toward my future. The girl who had spent 17 years feeling unwanted was about to become a woman who knew she was chosen, even if that knowledge had come at a terrible price. On graduation day, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I saw my entire family in the audience. Mom crying with pride, Gregory cheering loudly, and Dad standing with his hands over his heart, tears streaming down his face. For 17 years, I dreamed of this moment, of finally making him proud. But now that it was happening, I realized that his pride wasn't what I needed anymore. I was proud of myself, proud of the woman I'd become despite everything I'd endured. The truth had set us all free, but more importantly, it had set me free to become whoever I wanted to be. As I held my diploma high, I wasn't just celebrating my academic achievement, I was celebrating my survival, my strength, and my future.